All right, everyone. So you will recall, most of you anyway, that we just finished the story of Korach, his rebellion. Korach there's a plague as a result. Korach and those who accompany him get swallowed up by the earth. And then at the end, we get a much more positive image as Aaron, who was also being the revolt was also against him. They were speaking against him because he had a higher and more elevated status, Aaron and his sons, than anyone else in his tribe, the tribe of Levi. And so there's this kind of showdown at the end where the head of each tribe had a staff, and that staff was placed into the tabernacle, and Aaron's staff budded and flowered overnight. And as a consequence, we had this sense that in a very positive way, he and his tribe were chosen to be the ones who will lead the service of God and who will serve in the tabernacle. All of this, and now we are at the very end of chapter 17, just the last two verses. All of this leads the people to despair because they realize that God can strike out against them at any time. And moreover, this sense of Aaron's prerogatives and those of his sons are extremely strong. And any violation of them or overstepping will lead to terrible consequences. And if you look at verse 27 now, very end of chapter 17, the Israelites said to Moses, "Lo, we perish. We are lost, all of us lost. Everyone who ventures near the Lord's tabernacle must die. Alas, we are doomed to perish." So there is this sense, and you get a sense of the despair as it's repeated again and again, right? We perish, we're lost, we're doomed to perish, right? So the people are afraid. And the locus of that fear is the tabernacle. That's in the center of the camp. It is where God's presence comes and dwells. And there's a kind of paradox around the tabernacle, because on the one hand, we have this sense that God is really among the people, that God is leading them through the wilderness, that God is close to them. On the other hand, we have a sense that God's presence is dangerous. Don't come too close. There's an expression elsewhere that God is like a consuming fire. The rabbis pick up on this, by the way, with a very nice midrash where they say, if God is a consuming fire, we're also told to be close to God, to follow God. And how does one follow a consuming fire? And the answer is that we should do as God does. And what does God do? According to this midrash, right? God visits the sick and cares for the family when someone dies and so on. And they give various biblical verses which emphasize those qualities of God. So even though God is a consuming fire, we can draw close to God by doing acts of righteousness and kindness. Okay, so we're now at the very beginning, verse 1, chapter 18, on page 869, if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash. So God says to Aaron, right, and this is striking because it's only Aaron that God is talking to. Up to this point, God has been addressing Moses and Aaron, but here we're going to see perhaps some commentaries suggest there's a kind of reward for Aaron's actions during this rebellion. But what we're going to hear really applies to Aaron very specifically and to his family. You and your sons of the ancestral house under your charge, right? So that is Aaron and his sons, the priests, and then the ancestral house. We're talking about really the tribe of Levi. Shall bear any guilt connected with the sanctuary. You and your sons alone shall bear any guilt connected with the priesthood. So the people are worried that someone will do something wrong and they will be punished. And here Aaron is being told, it's not them who I'm going to punish. It's you and your family, right? There is this sense that they have this great privilege to serve God, to go in a place where the other Israelites are not allowed to go. But with that privilege come consequences, right? It ups the ante, as it were, and their missteps are going to be punished severely. They are the ones who will bear the guilt of violating that tabernacle. And you will associate yourself with your kinsmen, the tribe of Levi, your ancestral tribe, and they will be attached to you and will minister to you, while you and your sons under the charge are before the tent of the pact. So there's a role for the tribe of Levi, and then there's a role for Aaron and his sons. And the tribe of Levi, in part, is to serve the priesthood, right? We see this, you think about, there is a tradition, synagogue tradition, very strong in Orthodox congregations. It certainly exists in a good many conservative congregations where the priests come up and bless the congregation on holidays, called duchening. They go up to the front. And you might know this ritual. They put a tallis over their heads. They spread their fingers as they bless the people. Apparently, if you're a Star Trek fan, this is where Mr. Spock got his finger gesture from the gesture of the priests. At any rate, before they go up to do this, it is the tribe of Levi, right? If they are from Kohen, then they're the Levites, and they wash the hands of the priests, right? And that's really, even in modern times, kind of an enactment of what we have here, that the tribe of Levi is to serve the priests, and they will discharge their duties to you and to the tent, that is the tabernacle as a whole, but they must not have any contact with the furnishings of the shrine or the altar, lest both they and you die. So the role of the priest is to do the work in the tabernacle. They're the ones who offer sacrifices. But the tribe of Levi is there to support them. And the tribe of Levi will have the job of carrying the tabernacle, taking it apart, putting it together during the wanderings of the people in the wilderness, right? So there's a division of labor. And the important thing is that there is a boundary beyond, first of all, there's a boundary beyond which the people can't go. They're kept out of the tabernacle. And then within the tabernacle area, well, the tribe of Levi can set it up and take it down. They can't go in anywhere near the altar or have any contact with the furnishings. And, you know, the furnishings are not just the altar, but there's also the menorah inside. There's a table, which is called on which loaves of bread are placed out and so on. And they can't have any contact with them. They'll be attached to you, discharge the duties of the tent of meeting, all the service of the tent. No outsider shall intrude upon you. You shall discharge the duties connected with the shrine and the altar, that wrath may not again strike the Israelites, right? So one of the jobs of the Levites is to be guards. They have to protect the tabernacle, make sure for the people's own sake that they don't come too close. What I wanted to do is to suggest to you that we have seen something like this before. And if you like, I invite you to turn back actually to last week's Torah portion, to Yitro. And in last week's Torah portion, you'll find the description of the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. And what I'm particularly concerned with is, this is chapter 19 now of the book of Exodus. And we're going to begin with verse 10, 19 verse 10. And you have it on page 438 if you have the Eitz Chaim, 438. So what we have here is Moses reports the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and warn them to stay pure. Can everybody hear me okay? If you can, just nod your heads. Yeah, great, okay. For some reason, something's happening on my end with the headphones, but it doesn't matter. Okay, go to the people, warn them to stay pure tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes. Let them be ready for the third day. On the third day, the Lord will come down in the sight of the people. And God says, you should set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. And then it goes on, and the ram's horn will shout. And then if you go on the third day in verse 16, as the morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning, a dense cloud on the mountain, a loud blast of the shofar. And Moses led the people out of the camp towards God. They took their place on the foot of the mountain. And then as Moses now is going, God calls Moses to the top. And in verse 21, the Lord said to Moses, go down, warn the people not to break through, lest many of them perish. And so again and again at Mount Sinai, the people are warned, don't come too close. Right? Now, remember what happens at Sinai is that God, in some sense, descends to be there with Moses and to give him these tablets and the instruction he'll need to lead the people. Right? Now, God is not down among the people yet, but the same rules seem to apply. And in fact, some scholars have referred to the tabernacle as a portable Mount Sinai. And you can see it here. You can see the connection between Mount Sinai and the tabernacle, right? So there is that sense. And by the way, this idea that Sinai continues to exist among the people is carried on in the idea of the synagogue and particularly the Torah service. Right? Because remember, what's in the midst of the tabernacle is the ark, and it has within it the tablets. And there is this sense that when you hear the reading of the Torah on Shabbat in synagogue, you are standing at Sinai. Not to worry, you can go up close to the ark. It's not a problem, right? These rules don't apply. Nonetheless, there is this continuity of thought, first from biblical, then to rabbinic, and eventually to modern Judaism. At any rate, we've seen that the role of the priest, Aaron and his sons, is to minister. The role of the Levites is to support them and to take apart, put together, carry the tabernacle. Verse 6, now we're back on page 870. We're back in the book of Numbers. We're back chapter 18, verse 6. And God says, I will take your fellow Levites from among the Israelites. They are assigned to you in the dedication of the Lord to do the work of the tent of meeting, while you and your sons shall be careful to perform all your priestly dues in everything pertaining to the altar and to that which is behind the curtain. I make your priesthood a service of dedication Any outsider who encroaches shall be put to death. So that's their rule. It's just kind of a summary. And now, what do they get for this? Right? On the one hand, the consequences of violating this sacred space are extremely high. But they do get some privileges. And that's what we're going to see next. The Lord spoke to Aaron, I hereby give you charge of all my gifts, all the sacred donations of the Israelites, I grant them to you and your sons as a perquisite, a due for all time. They shall be yours from the most holy sacrifices, the gifts, every such offering they render to me as most holy sacrifices, namely the grain offering, purification offering, reparation, they shall belong to you and your sons. You will partake of them as most sacred donations. Only males may eat of them. You shall treat them as consecrated. Okay, so they get to eat that which the Israelites bring to the altar, right? I mean, you may wonder, like, what gets done with it? Right? If you bring a grain offering, right? Or as we're going to see, the first fruits and so on, does it just get thrown away? No, it doesn't. You're giving it to God, and as it were, God is giving it to the priests, and this sustains them. Because, and we're going to see this with the whole tribe of Levi, they have no allotment in the land. They don't get any land. They are there to serve the people, to represent the people, and therefore the people have to maintain them. And we'll go on to read just a little more of it. This too shall be yours, the gift offerings of their contributions, all the elevation offerings, and those things I give to you, your sons and your daughters, that are your due for all time. Everyone in your household can eat of it. So, certain sacrifices, just the men. I can't explain to you why that is. I don't really know, except perhaps because the men are the ones who are actually doing the physical offering. But then there is the gift offerings, which in Hebrew is truma, the truma, which comes from the Israelites. It's something that they have to give the priests as a kind of tithe, right? The truma is there for the households of the priests, including their wives and their children. So you might, if you think about this, you realize that not only is the priesthood sustained, but they, because they receive from everyone, they get a fair amount, because the tithe is set aside by the whole people, and they can't eat it. It all goes to the priest. So there's this story in the Talmud, which I think is quite a remarkable story. You know that the Bible, the Torah in particular, seems to allow polygamy, right? So Jacob is married not just to Rachel, but to Leah. And we have other examples. Certainly when you get to King Solomon, who has more wives than we can count, at least that I can count off the top of my head, right? There seems to be an allowance for polygamy. But when you get to the rabbinic period, the rabbis only have one wife. It seems that polygamy was always the exception rather than the rule. Rabbis, we don't know of any rabbi in the Talmud, either the Babylonian or the Jerusalem Talmud, who has more than one wife, with one exception, and that is Rabbi Tarfon. And you may remember Rabbi Tarfon from the Passover Seder. He's one of those guys who are in Akko, and we read about them at the beginning of the Haggadah. Anyway, it's a period of famine. Rabbi Tarfon, I have to mention, is a Kohen. It's a period of famine. People are starving. Who has grain? The priests have it, because it's been contributed to them. So what does Rabbi Tarfon do? He goes out and he marries 300 women. Why? Because once they are married to the priest, they can eat truma, right? And so in order to sustain them at a time of famine, he marries them. It's kind of the exception which proves the rule in some ways, right? But I think it's a wonderful story. It takes this law about the sons and the daughters, and it humanizes it, I think, in a wonderful way. At any rate, they also get, we're now at verse 12, the best of the new oil and wine and grain, the choice parts of everything they present, I give to you. Now, before we go on, if you think about it, the people are bringing all this food, and they're bringing animals and so on, and the priests get it. But there is here a potential for corruption. From the people's point of view, they're going to a holy place and they're offering a sacred donation. But the priests, well, this is just the food that they're getting all the time. And it's easy for them to lose a sense of the sanctity and the importance of this moment to the people who are coming and bringing these offerings. I once saw something that really kind of shocked me. It's understandable, but it doesn't have to do with this particularly, but we had a scribe who we called in to fix our Torah scrolls. So we called him in, and he looked at it. He felt he couldn't do the work right there. So he was going to take it back and then bring it back to us. So he took it and he put it in a garbage bag and he put it in the back of his car. And I have to say, it was, like the Torah, really? You're going to take the Torah and put it in this bag? But for him, certainly it's legitimate, you can do it. And for him, this is just his work. This is what he does. And so there is a kind of a diminution of the sanctity through familiarity. Right? And this can go even a step further and really enter into, not with the scribe, but with the priests in the tabernacle. So I wanted to remind you of really a story about how bad this can get. The story is in the first book of Samuel. The book opens with the story of Hannah. Story I think is well known. In fact, it's the Haftorah on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Hannah goes to the priest, to Eli at Shiloh, and she prays for a son. Her lips move. He thinks she's drunk. No, it's just sincere prayer. And as you probably know, this is where we get the model of prayer from Hannah, that when we say the Amidah, we say it with our lips moving, but we're not heard, right? Because we don't want to disturb the people around us. Anyway, she goes back, she has a child, but we're also told this story. So Elkanah and Hannah go home to Ramah, right? This is after the child's born. And they leave the child with Eli, with the priest who is in Shiloh. And now the book of Samuel tells us, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They paid no heed to the Lord. This is how the priest used to deal with the people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest boy would come along with a 3-pronged fork while the meat was still boiling. And he would thrust it into the cauldron or the kettle or the great pot or the small cooking pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take away. This was the practice at Shiloh when all the Israelites came there. But now, even before the suet was turned into smoke, the priest's boy would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, hand over some of the meat to roast for the priest. He will not accept boiled meat from you, only raw. And if the man said to him, let them first turn the suet into smoke, which, by the way, is what the Torah required, then take as much as you want, he, the servant, would reply, no, hand it over at once or I'll take it by force. The sin of the young man against the Lord was very great, for the men treated the Lord's offering impiously. And ultimately, that's the end of it, but ultimately Samuel is actually sent to Eli to tell him the consequences of his son's behavior, because it's clear that Eli knew exactly what was going on, right? So you can see how familiarity really can lead to terrible, terrible things. We have the assumption that that doesn't happen. Remember also that we were already told that the priests will bear the consequences of what they're doing, right? So on the one hand, they have this elevated role. On the other hand, for them, the consequences can be very great. Okay, I'm going to stop for a moment. Let me turn the view to the gallery so I can see you all. Any questions up to this point? Anybody at all? Just raise your hand if anything strikes you. And yeah, Hannah, go ahead. You have to unmute.
I wonder if there was resentment of the power that was vested in the priesthood. I don't know how we'd know, but if there's any record of.
Yeah, no, we don't know. It would seem natural. Here in the context in the book of Numbers, you have to have a sense that there's relief, right? That actually the danger of being that close to the tabernacle is something that they have to worry about, right? But remember that we already, in some ways, just saw a story about that kind of jealousy, and that was Korach, right? I mean, it is Korach and his followers who are from the tribe of Levi, but not Aaron's sons, who make this rebellion and who say, what made you so holy? And Moses' response to them, of course, is, hey, you're Levites. You already have, an elevated position. So there is this potential, I think, really for jealousy. I don't know if it exists to this day, you see the Kohen always go up for the first Aliyah. Sometimes people in synagogue can wait months before they get an Aliyah. Meanwhile, if there aren't so many Kohanim there, that guy seems to get an Aliyah every third week, right? So I guess there's a potential even now. Marilyn, you had your hand up. Unmute, please.
Why is God being so severe?
So there is, yes, it's a great, in other words, why is it so exacting, right? That if you violate this in some small way, that there are dire consequences. There is a sense in which it's almost something that God can't quite control. That coming too close has a consequence that it's not so much that God is going to smite you as there's something inherent in that kind of proximity, which is just really dangerous. I sometimes think about this like a nuclear reactor, right? You can't get too close. And in fact, you can think about the tabernacle as a kind of containment vessel, right? Why does the tabernacle, if you look in the book of Exodus, we have all of this very detailed description of exactly how it has to be made. The measurements are extremely exact. The materials, very, very specific, right? So how do we understand that? One scholar, Baruch Levine, who's written a great deal about the book of Exodus and also Numbers and the whole business of, Leviticus and also Numbers, really talks about this sense that if God is going to kind of be present, that this vehicle for God's presence really has to be very specific, because there's a real danger. And we saw that also with Sinai, right? This sense, don't come too close lest you die. It is, and we saw last week a little bit with this notion of God's wrath as being somehow independent of God. So, I mean, look, you can say on the one hand, well, God can control anything, right? God created the world. But there is in the Bible a sense that there are things that are set into motion that are, it's not quite exact, but it's almost like saying, well, can God change the laws of physics? Well, yeah, I guess, but God doesn't really. We can't expect that. And so God's role here is to act to protect the people, but it's not exactly clear that God can stop it from happening if they get too close. Yeah, Myra, go ahead, unmute.
Okay, I get the feeling, reading all this, that God is human. He acts like a human being, jealousy, anger, I'm going to get you. It doesn't, I don't get this feeling that this is an omnipotence, can't say the word, an omnipotence in person who is just above it all.
Yes, I think it's a very good point. So we tend to think of God really through the lens of Greek philosophy. I mean, we're the heirs in the modern world of that, right? So we had this idea in Aristotle that God is the unmoved mover, right? There is this sense that God is really abstract. We see this also Maimonides, right? Who comes out of that Greek tradition, who says, well, the only thing we can know about God is what God isn't. We can really know nothing about what God is. But there is another tradition which sees God in very human terms. And I think that tradition is really inherent here in the Torah from the beginning. So a kind of classic example has to do with the flood. Right? So God creates the world and God says it's very good. Right? On the last day, each day it's balanced, it's orderly, and it's very good. So then what happens? The people do not live up to the divine expectations. And God gets frustrated and God floods the world. And then God regrets it. Right? God regrets it. And in fact, God puts the bow in the cloud, the rainbow, as a reminder not to do it again. It's a reminder to us, but there is a sense it's a reminder to God. And it's an ancient mythological motif, by the way. The bow is really the bow, like a bow and arrow. Right? It's God's bow. Not that God really has a bow, right? But the idea that God puts the bow down, as it were, symbolically, and will not destroy the earth. So we have here, when you say that human beings are created in the divine image, what does that exactly mean? It seems to mean, at least in the Torah, that there are similarities between us and God. And just as we learn from experience, God learns from experience. I don't want to push this too far, right? Because God is not capricious. If you look at the difference between God and, say, the gods of the Greeks, right? The Greeks of the gods are completely immoral. They're always looking for what's good for them. Their interactions with human beings, they're kind of playing with us. That's the sense you see in the Iliad and the Odyssey. They have favorites, some they like, some they don't like. They get angry if you slight them in some way. And in fact, for the Greeks, the only difference really between the gods, they have certain powers, mainly they're immortal. Human beings die, the gods don't die, right? So they're called the immortals. But even in its most anthropomorphic, in the biblical tradition, God is human-like in some ways, but God is the source of morality and justice. God is deeply concerned with compassion and holds people accountable to it. But yes, God seems very real. And you can ask, well, when it says God took us out of Egypt, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, does God really have hands and arms? Right? Is God that human-like? And there were certainly mystics, medieval Jewish mystics, who thought really that God really looked like a person. There's a little indication of that even in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a vision of God and it looks kind of human. The medieval mystical book called Shir HaKomah, it's a measurement, contains in it measurements of the divine body. It seems very strange to us. It was really as a kind of means of contemplation, right? Yet some physical image. It's certainly very far from any idea modern Jews have of God at all. But the biblical, just to come back to Myra, to your question, yeah, God seems very human. Other comments or questions, Sandy?
So, Rabbi, in the beginning of chapter 18, when it says, "Thou and thy sons and thy father's home with thee shall bear the iniquity of the sanctuary," and it later says, "shall bear the iniquity of your priesthood," is that referring to what happens in the tabernacle, or is that referring to their lives in general, or both?
It definitely refers to what's happening in the tabernacle.
Just there?
Just right. In life in general, everybody sins and everybody bears consequences, right? For the priests here, the discussion is specific to the tabernacle, what their job is, what they receive as a consequence of their job. Okay. I saw one other hand, Chana, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, don't we have a prescription against having a graven image? Wouldn't that make us quite different from other religions?
Yeah, oh, yes, absolutely. Although the question of graven images is really whether they're, we are not to make it any representations of God.
Mhm.
That's what the Ten Commandments say, although there's even a question as to whether you can make representations of anything, but it's really about creating something for worship. You shouldn't bow down to it and so on. Yeah, sure. It's a basic difference between the pagan worldview and going all the way back to the worldview of the ancient Israelites and the Canaanites and those around them. Sandy?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, just a follow-up on that. Is it during Yom Kippur when the cantor walks down the aisle and says the prayer about
Right, Hineni.
Yeah,
So that's a little different. The role of the cantor or the chazan really is, as much as we talk on the high holidays about we individuals come before God and pray and that's absolutely what's going on, right? On the other hand, the role of the chazan is also in some ways to represent us in prayer. It's called a shaliach sibur, right? A shaliach is an emissary, right? An agent of the congregation, of the community. So he has this role, or she, excuse me for saying he, right? Could be either, has this role of representing the people. So he's going to go, or she is going to go forward and is going to lead the prayers. And so the Hineni prayer is really a way for the priest, for the chazan to say, look, I'm a flawed human being, right? I will be representing them. Don't hold any of my shortcomings against them. Right? So it's a little bit different, the role here. It's true that the priest kind of represents the people in some ways, but I think the context is very different. Okay. So I want to move on. Oh, except, yeah, let's move on. I'll ask you all to mute yourselves once again. I'm going to go back to the speaker view. And we're going to pick up where we left off. So I want to pick up again with this, all the sacred gifts that I'm at verse 19, that the Israelites set aside for the Lord, I give to you, your sons, your daughters with you, as a due for all time. It's an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord and for you and for your offspring as well. So I'm not really sure what this idea is of a covenant of salt. It's a term that's used, Brit Melach. It seems to be, we know about the importance of salt in the ancient world in general. It was the only preservative that they had. It was considered very valuable. It was expensive. There is this sense that it lasts, it's precious. More than that, I don't know. It's used elsewhere. It's used also among ancient Canaanites. It's as an expression. So I don't know more about it than that. And then the Lord says to Aaron, you shall, however, have no territorial share among them or any portion in their midst. I am your portion and your share, right? So again, you don't get any land. The Levites, and to the Levites, I hereby give all the tithes in Israel as their share in return for the services that they perform, services of the tent of meeting. So they get, the priest gets sustained by these offerings that people bring in, right? They get the meat, they get the oil, the wine, all of that, but it's not going to be enough for the whole tribe, right? So we have a tithe, 10%. All of your agricultural produce gets tithed. 10% you give to the priests, to the tribe of Levi, and that is what sustains them. Right? Henceforth, the Israelites shall not trespass in the tent of meeting, thus incur guilt. Only the Levites will perform. It's a law for all times. They shall have no territorial share among the Israelites. It is the tithes set aside by the Israelites as a gift to the Lord. I give to the Levites. Therefore, I have said concerning them, they have no territory. Right? So they give a tithe. And now, what about the Levites themselves? When you receive from the Israelites their tithes, which I have assigned to you as your share, you will set aside 1/10 of the tithe as a gift to the Lord. So the Levites get 10%, and then they have to give 10% from their tithe, and that goes to the priest. So this idea that receiving the tithe still leaves you with an obligation to give is the basis for something which I think is a remarkable law that we find in the Talmud. And that has to do with tzedakah. So people have an obligation to give tzedakah. How much of your income do you have to give? The Talmud doesn't exactly say, but there are places where it's suggested. Maimonides in his code quantifies it, at least 5%. 10% should be about right, no more than 20%. This is really interesting, that there's a maximum, right? Right? I mean, if you're very wealthy, 20% is a lot of money, right? But still, the idea is we are not to impoverish ourselves. You shouldn't feel guilty because you have a lot more than someone else. You're entitled, but you have to take care of them. Anyway, so the tithe is given to the poor. It's called Maser Oni, the poor person's tithe. This is in addition to the tithe that you might give to the tribe of Levi. And certainly once the whole agricultural system breaks down, this is really what you're doing. You're giving a Maser Oni, a tithe to the poor. Here's the thing. The poor must also tithe. Just, you're on the dole, right, to use modern terminology, but you still have to give it. The poor person has to give tzedakah. I think that if you talk, I mean, you don't lose responsibility. And more than that, I think inherent in this idea is a certain kind of dignity. Right? You're not just a taker, you're a giver. And I think you see it already here with the idea that the Levites themselves have to give a tithe. And it goes on to talk about this will count as your gift, new grain from the threshing floor. You set aside a gift from the Lord from the tithes you receive from the Israelites, and you set aside all the gifts of the Lord, and so on. I do want to just find one thing, which yes. I want to, we're going to do this next time because I skipped over it because I really wanted to come as far as we could, just following the regular text, because what I wanted, I'll take you back just to see it, and then we'll talk about it next week. If you look back to verse 13 on page 872, the first fruits of everything in your land they'll bring to the Lord shall be yours. Every one of your household who is pure may eat them. This is directed to the priests. They get the first fruits. Everything that has been prescribed in Israel shall be yours. And then the first issue of the womb of every being, man or beast, that is offered to the Lord shall be yours. But you shall have the firstborn of man redeemed, and you shall have the firstling of impure animals redeemed. Take as their redemption price from the age of 1 month up, the monetary equivalent of 5 shekels. All right, so first fruits, first crops, first human beings belong to God. How do we deal with that? They don't become slaves. They have to be redeemed. And how do they get redeemed? 5 shekels. So you probably know this is the basis for Pidyon Habet, a ritual that is done today. So I want to come back to this. I want to come back also to the notion of first fruits, because we do have a ritual of first fruits in the temple, in the time of the temple. So we'll do that next week. And then we're going to move on really a few verses at the end, which are not particularly significant. And then we're going to move on to next week's Parsha, which is the next section, which is Hukat, which contains the law of the red heifer, which is a very odd law, and also Moses' sin and the consequences of that. So I'll give you an opportunity. We just have a couple of minutes left. Any other questions? Saul, go ahead. Unmute, please. Saul, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Okay, the covenant of salt
Yeah.
that you mentioned. Hertz makes a very nice commentary about this. He says a permanent covenant, as salt preserves food from putrefaction, it becomes the emblem of permanence. So that's where they get his berit melach.
Yes. Nice. Very nice. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay, great. So I look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll pick up where we left off. As always, I welcome any questions or thoughts during the week. If you want to send me an email, I will, again, if you know somebody who might be interested in the class, please let them know. I'm always happy to have more people. I will send out a link to the YouTube recording later in the week, so you can look at it again, or I know there are a lot of people who are not here, and it helps for them. So we'll do that out, and I'll send you a reminder again of the link, so you don't have to keep saving it and looking for it. So have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, everybody. Bye.
Bye.